Hello, everyone. Amar, thank you so much for that introduction, and the importance of those remarks cannot be underestimated. I mean, this really is why we do this, and we want particularly for you as the next generation of journalists to have an understanding of some of the risks, but also some of the great rewards and importance of what we do as journalists and reporters, particularly on the international stage. Today, we are indeed talking about international reporting, and we wanted to, of course, keep forefront in our minds Austin Tyson, Evan Gershkovich, but there are, as Amar referenced, hundreds of other journalists who are currently imprisoned simply for doing their jobs. And journalism, by the way, is not a crime. There are many more who have paid the ultimate sacrifice just for doing the work. And so we wanted to turn to a couple of voices who would bring us some special insight into the experience of international journalists and into the questions about how we as reporters can best protect ourselves. And by the way, this is also extended in some situations to domestic reporting in the US, some of the violence that has taken place against reporters in the US as well. So we wanted to bring our guests in now. Elisa Liz Munoz is Executive Director of the International Women's Media Foundation, the IWMF.org. Please take a look at their website and at their work because it is quite important as well. Its mission is to support women and non-binary journalists and help to develop their careers. We'll talk more about their Courage in Journalism Awards, which they give later in our program. Elisa is a leading expert on that intersection between gender equity and press freedom, and she's a relentless advocate, as her whole organization is, for women and non-binary journalists, spotlighting the challenges they face. Also with us here is Gordon Fairclough, who is the world coverage chief for the Wall Street Journal. Some of you may know him from your internships. He directs all of the journal's coverage, all of it, from outside the United States, and there are a whole bunch of countries out there. He has also served as the politics and economy editor for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Previously, Gordon was the journal's South Asia bureau chief, overseeing coverage of violence against women in India, the devastating earthquake in Nepal, the election of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, among other key stories that he's been involved with. Gordon was part of the team in China that won the 2000 Pulitzer for international reporting. And he's also had this is quite a list. He's had postings in Prague, South Korea, Japan, Bangkok, and New York. Today, he joins us from London. We thank you both for being with us and talking about this. Gordon, I want to go very quickly to you right away and to address this question that I think is probably on the minds of a lot of the interns in this audience today, and that is, how do they get a job like yours? What is it that leads people to have international reporting careers? Because I think there are many people who would like to be involved in that. Is it just language skill or some cultural competency? What does it take to get one of those postings as you've had?
Well, I think it's really hard to generalize, Joey. I can talk about my case and maybe a bit about Evan's case. I think we are kind of emblematic in that every correspondent's career path is pretty idiosyncratic. I think a lot of it depends on being in the right place at the right time and a good bit of luck, and we're all extraordinarily fortunate to have the jobs that we have. And I think it starts with a real passion for trying to explain to people what's happening around the world and a great curiosity about what is going on there. As you probably saw in the video, Evan had a bit of a circuitous path to his job. After undergraduate, he worked as a chef in New York for a while, became a news assistant at the New York Times, ended up working for the New York Times public editor, who's the paper's ombudsman at the time, and then was a news assistant really on the foreign desk, I think, at the Times. And got the advice, well, you know what, you grew up speaking Russian, maybe you should go and try your hand in Moscow, and he did, and went and worked for the Moscow Times, which is an exceptionally good English language paper in Russia, where a lot of the top Moscow correspondents working for big international publications today got their starts. We have a number of people who've worked at Moscow Times. Then he went to work for Agence France Presse, the wire service, and we hired him there. And so I think you'll find that organizations like the Journal generally are recruiting from the ranks of other big news organizations or from our domestic staffs, because in general, the foreign correspondent jobs, we look for people with a certain level of seniority and experience. But to your point, Joy, I think language is a great place to start getting stuck in, because that's how I think most of us got our first break, was because we could speak a language somewhere and go and report on it.
And in your experience, was that the case?
Yes, it was. In my experience, I learned to speak Thai also somewhat through serendipity, and my first assignment was in Thailand, and went from there.
We talk about the threats to international journalists, and I'd like to get to how some of that has changed. But I just have to ask you, have you faced physical or other threats in your reporting? Have you experienced the kind of dangers that we're talking about in international journalism?
Well, give you a sense of how much things have changed. When I was an intern back in 1993, I was sent to Cambodia, and the regular,
As an intern?
As an intern, and the regular correspondent was out sick and with malaria. And I was sent to accompany some UN peacekeeping forces that were protecting ethnic Vietnamese fisher people. Our group came under fire from the Khmer Rouge. Of course, I knew not the first thing about it. And that's the kind of thing that would never happen at the Wall Street Journal today. I could assure you of that. But I think it is a fairly routine experience for folks who work in less free societies. I was detained while working in China. In my case, very briefly, a matter of hours, and the foreign ministry leaned on the local police to let me go. But things have changed, enormously, right, in that time, both in the threats I think that we face, but also in how seriously we take those and how much we try to prepare ourselves and all of our reporters for those threats. I mean, it's a very different ball game, and I have to commend the Journal and everybody from Almar on down, and the amount of resources that we dedicate and the focus that we pay to staff safety. It's an expensive undertaking, as you can imagine.
Yeah, this is a good point actually to bring Elisa in on. Your organization, I know, IWMF, and I think we're going to put into the chat as well some of the resources, links to the resources that you all provide. But Elisa, things have changed. The kinds of specific toolkit of information that journalists need before going out into the field, particularly in these international and conflict situations. How are organizations really able to help their reporters before they get in trouble?
There's been a real evolution of not just the journalism industry, but of the threats and attacks that journalists receive around the world, locally as local journalists and as international journalists. And we've also seen a real culture shift in the way that these threats and attacks are being addressed by hopefully most major media organizations. And there's also tools available for freelancers, but not as many tools and resources as are needed. I think that major media organizations like Dow Jones, New York Times, Washington Post, and others have really embraced a culture of safety for their journalists. What does this mean? It means that sometimes they're giving hostile environments training. They have on-staff security directors. They and their editors undertake security assessments before every assignment. They have procedures and protocols that they undertake. And I just want to stress that there are so many resources available online for journalists who aren't lucky enough to be working in these major organizations, where they can walk through security assessments. The IWMF has security experts on call. So there really is a need, especially at the young journalist stage of development. And a lot of organizations also are working on the university level, where they're actually a little bit further behind the news industry in terms of making journalism safety and the need to consider safety and assessments and protocols a part of their academic training as well.
This is also a product, isn't it? I mean, like, increased awareness is the result of increased problems, right? I mean, I'll just say that I'm a mature journalist, and I would say that things have changed in the field. And certainly, you know, the way we went into the business was more the, hey, you would only get in trouble if you accidentally, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it certainly seems the environment in many locations has changed to the point of you might just be seen as a convenient political pawn or something to make a statement by various governments and non-governmental entities as well.
I think that for international journalists, the threats have indeed changed. And in actual conflict zones, I mean, I think everybody talks about the fact that journalists are not wearing a press emblem in many locations. In some, it can still be a protective measure, but in most places, announcing that you're a journalist, unfortunately, has put a target on journalists' back instead of serving as a protective emblem. So I think in that way it has changed. The IWF has been giving the Courage in Journalism Awards since 1990. So for local journalists, this kind of threat and attack and imprisonment, threats against families have been going on around the world, where press freedom is not regarded as something to be protected. And unfortunately, in the last 6 years, we've seen a shift in the United States in terms of the safety of journalists there. I would also say very quickly that the individuals who are doing the attacking also has changed. It used to be a lot more focused on governments doing the imprisoning and the attacks. And it has really shifted into criminal organizations, individuals, mobs. So really, journalists, unfortunately, are under threat everywhere by everybody. And this creates a kind of hostile environment, even in their own homes, when they're facing online attacks that I know we'll talk about later. So it's critical that journalists take into consideration the kinds of processes and skills and support systems that they need to do this work as safely as possible.
Yeah, I do want to refer, and I see that we put in, Freedom Forum has put into the chat a link to the Courage in Journalism Awards at IWMF. And I really encourage all of you in the audience to take a look at the stories of these journalists. One is my former colleague at Jazeera, Shireen Abu Akleh, who was a Palestinian American who was, in fact, to your point, wearing a press label on her helmet and vest at the time that she was killed in West Bank. So yeah, it's not as simple as saying, "Oh, we're press, don't shoot at us," right, Gordon? I mean, this is a thing that has evolved, changed, and frankly gotten more disturbing.
Yeah, I think we've seen, and I think that Alyssa's right. The range of threats is not just government, but one of the starkest changes that we have seen is the shift in government attitudes towards reporters. And, for much of my career, being an accredited correspondent in a country gave you an almost quasi-diplomatic kind of protection, right? That you were permitted to be there, reporting on that country. That basically, when I was in China, the worst thing that I had to worry about, I felt, was getting kicked out of China, right? I was not going to be sent to prison. I was not going to be physically harmed. And I think that, we've seen with Evan is that standard is eroding, and it hasn't been since the Cold War that an American journalist has been charged with espionage in Russia. That is it's a big step and a big breaking of one of the main kind of international rules of the road for foreign correspondents. And I think that we are seeing increasingly other governments also transgressing, the sort of previous standards of conduct, putting pressure onto journalists' families, taking other kinds of harassing measures, steps like that. And so we are seeing this in an increasing number of places, and our wonderful security staff likes to talk about escalatory paths, you will frequently see a progression of increasingly hostile steps happening against you, which, in theory, when things start seeming hostile enough, that gives you the clue that you should get out, right? But
Can you give me just some examples of some of those things? I mean, what kinds of things are they looking for? People being followed?
It depends. It depends very, very widely. I mean, it can go from where in the previous world, you might get called in by the foreign ministry and, yelled at as a bureau chief for something that your publication did that they didn't like. Then it becomes, you're being doxxed online, right? Your cell phone number and your address and your photo are being put up on some government-related website to direct people at you. Your apartment is broken into. Security services visit you at home, that kind of thing, right? And you're coming under increasing pressure and scrutiny. But, in the case of Evan, I mean, it was a major discontinuity to go straight to arresting him and charging him with espionage, as opposed to, detaining him if they wanted to scare or harass him, to expelling him, and in Russia, we were being reaccredited every 3 months, right? And the government keeping you on a very, reserving its right to basically not let you back in, right? Every 3 months. And they kept extending his credentials. Government's behaviors are changing more rapidly, I think, than we have seen in the past, and these escalatory, paths can move quite quickly.
I want to just say to our audience, I do not see you guys in the chat, but I want to encourage you perhaps to use the Q&A box to file any questions that you might have. And I'm sure you do, because you're young journalists, so you must have questions for our panelists. So please take advantage of the opportunity to give us any questions there as well. You made reference, Gordon, to doxing, and this is part of this wider package of harassment. I mean, the level of physical threat is certainly still very high, but also these additional kinds of threats. Online harassment, Elisa, this is a different environment than, frankly, we knew in the past.
It is indeed. Recent research shows that 73% of women journalists say they've experienced online violence. This includes 25% of whom say they've had threats of physical violence, 20% say they've had threats of sexual violence. And that becomes even more terrifying when you see the data that shows that 20% of these attacks lead to real life attacks. Another thing that makes it particularly terrifying is that a journalist receiving these threats has no way of knowing how credible they are. There are tricks that one can use if you're data savvy. You can look at the VPN where your attacker may be located, but they might be using a VPN, which means you have no way of knowing whether they're next door or around the world. And so we have digital security experts that can help journalists who are going through these kinds of attacks, but there's never enough experts to go around because this is so incredibly prevalent. I just want to give a few examples of the government actions that are really textbook, and you see governments repeating the tactics against the journalists who are particularly troublesome in their minds. And so just to go through a few, you have the case of Maria Ressa, Nobel Prize winner, head of a Philippine media organization called Rappler, who has been relentlessly publicly attacked by Duterte, and that has led to massive online violence and abuse, constant and vile. Bolsonaro attacking Patricia Campos Melo, publicly calling her out online, using gender-based attacks against her, also resulting in massive online attacks but around the country targeted at her. You have AMLO in Mexico targeting Carmen Aristegui, same thing, publicly naming these journalists, leading to online attacks. And of course, you have Modi calling out Rana Ayub, and also calling out American journalist Sabrina Siddiqui, leading to the same kind of massive online attacks. When you say online, it may lead some to think that this is not as serious as physical attacks. I just noted the 20% convergence to physical attacks, but in and of themselves, these online attacks and these online violence has incredible consequences for the journalists, leading them to be not able to work because their social feeds are completely eaten up by this. So they have to actually get offline for a while, sometimes being doxxed, as was mentioned earlier, their address and telephone numbers being revealed, their families being attacked. And this often leads to symptoms very similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, for which there is a real need to have not only digital security support, but also mental health support. And those are some of the resources that the IWMF has offered throughout this past year. We've focused almost exclusively on online violence and created a coalition of 70 organizations that are focused on addressing this issue. And we created a mental health guide for journalists, as well as a guide for media organizations to support their journalists experiencing online violence. And our hope is that we have this same culture shift that has occurred over the last 15 years with physical violence to online violence, and the recognition of the need for media organizations to address it as the real threat that it is.
I want to get to a couple of questions in our Q&A box. And of course, others of you are welcome to post your questions as well. But a couple of them really seem to have to do with identity, right? So one attendee is asking, is it necessary to be fluent in a second language to be a foreign correspondent? I think the answer is it can't hurt, right? That's the short answer.
It can't hurt, but it's also not necessary. And you know, I did speak Thai. My Korean is really terrible. But if you work for a news organization with enough resources, you know, you have interpreters and people who will help you with that. So I would say it's often extremely helpful at the start of your career, and less necessary depending on what you're doing as you go. But obviously what you report and write is very different when you speak the language and when you don't. And I think you could do good good and very valuable work in both cases, but they are different.
So this other question actually is sort of pertinent to that, even though it has to do with an attendee who is a domestic journalist who says, I am sometimes weary of doing stories that may put me in danger. I live in a city that's overwhelmed by mass gun violence. As a Black journalist, I'm sort of tasked to go cover situations that involve people who look like me, despite the environment being fairly dangerous. How can I increase my confidence when doing hard news like that? This is an interesting question, not only domestically, but internationally. I think, when I've been in Asia, obviously, there's certain expectations of me because people can see my face. And then I think that there might be a different expectation if they were to look at you, Gordon.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think that's something that needs to be factored in when you think about security. And risk. I think there are places where women face considerably more risks. You may face considerably more risks depending on your ethnicity or your heritage. I think we routinely find, and I think Elisa would agree with this, that women tend to be especially singled out, and women who have some connection to the country, whether their grandparents were born there or their so we'll find that say reporters of South Asian origin reporting on things in South Asia face a lot more kind of online harassment, and even when it's not harassment, I find I spent much of a year in Japan after the Fukushima earthquake there. And I had a colleague who was Japanese, but grew up abroad entirely. And so he spoke quite good Japanese, but he spoke kind of at-home Japanese, not
formal Japanese, yeah, sure.
Yeah, not formal, and I could walk into the mayor's office and say, hey, Mayor Tobo, what's up? And he'd give me a hug. And if Dai walked in and used the wrong register of formal Japanese, you could see it on his face. It was almost like the mayor had been slapped, and he knew, obviously, intellectually, that Dai was not a native Japanese speaker, but because Dai looks Japanese, his first instinct was that he was being insulted by Dai.
So to this,
so it's tough and it's a challenge.
Yeah. So to this questioner, I mean, this is a specific point he's making. He or she they are a Black journalist. They are concerned about that building that relationship and increasing their confidence when doing hard news. I mean, I understand this quite completely because I've been reporting in Asia and I've had that experience where, I sound like this, but I look like this, and they can see you coming. How do you sort of leap over that hurdle to say, yes, you can relate to me, but also understand that I have a job to do?
Being a white guy, I may not be the best person to answer that, since I've also not worked in I guess I have worked in some European countries, but it can be it can work to your advantage and it can work against you, and I think everybody finds a way to make it work. And I think a lot of what we do as journalists is try to establish some connectivity and connection with the people that we're trying to talk to and get information from. And I think you need to be aware, right, that these things can cut different ways.
Right. Yeah. And Elisa, do you have that do you see that in other seminars and in other questions of identity, how people relate can be both a positive and negative thing? I think Maria Ressa, for example, is particularly a thorn in the side of the Philippine government because she's a Filipina, has long-standing roots in the country, and maybe they have different expectations of her.
Right. Absolutely. Identity is a very important factor when it comes to safety. That's why the IWMF safety training really focuses on identity-based training. And I think it's really critical that editors around the world also be very cognizant of what those identities mean when the person is on the ground. And again, I just want to reiterate, I would never in a million years suggest that you take identity into consideration when making a reporting assignment, but you absolutely must take it into consideration when you're doing a security assessment and realizing how that person is going to be perceived on the ground. With regard to the specific question and confidence, I think it's really important to educate yourself about safety issues and the steps that you can take, the precautionary steps that you can take before you go into the field. Doing that security assessment, I'll just a few of the tips that our security directors always make. Get a map of the area and be sure that you are aware of the exit zones where you can get out if a mob scene starts to develop. Be clear about if you're in an enclosed location where those exits are. Don't be, depending on the situation, try to be discreet about what you're doing there. So, I mean, that's just a couple of things, but there are all kinds of resources that one can find. And if it is at all possible for you to attend a hostile environments training course, I guarantee you that that will give you a lot more confidence. We hear from the people who attend our courses how much better they feel once they have that information.
And Gordon, to go back to one of the questioners online, Adam Benson, who says, one thing I haven't been able to understand is why Evan in particular was targeted and arrested by the Russian government, as hundreds of journalists are in country reporting, and hundreds in Ukraine as well, reporting on the conflict. Was it to gain leverage with Western nations or on future hostage prisoner exchanges? There's about 15 things wrapped up in that one question, Adam. But I think, again, to identity, was there some expectation that Evan should do something differently, or that Evan was a better target? Because clearly he was not involved in espionage.
No, he was not. In Evan's case, I don't think his identity as an American, I think, had something to do with it. And obviously, the Russian government's only communication with us has been that he was committing espionage, which we know is not the case. So we're kind of left to guess. Otherwise, there have been a number of quite direct if not completely explicit, mentions of prisoner exchanges, right? When discussions of Evan's detention come up by various Russian officials, we know that Russia has in the past, and with other American prisoners deemed wrongfully detained, engaged in prisoner swap. So I do think that Evan was taken because the Russians were looking to have an American hostage, right? Brittany Griner had been released. They weren't getting what they wanted for Paul Whelan. And so they upped the ante by grabbing
Evan. This also ties into the other question I'm seeing here. Have you heard of a reporter experiencing inability to report in a foreign country because of their identity? My family, political refugees, I know I would not be welcome in their home country, especially as a journalist. This is a really interesting connection to Evan's situation, right? Because his parents left country, brought the kids out of the country. And of course, on the other hand, he probably has very strong feelings and ties and language skills and cultural competency to report there. So, is it better to focus on other countries where you don't have those?
I think there's no blanket answer to that. I agree with Elisa that we would never make a decision about assigning someone based on their identity, but we certainly would take it into account in what we needed to do to try to ensure their safety and their effectiveness. I mean, there are places, if you were of Pakistani origin, or your parents or grandparents were Pakistani origin, right, your likelihood of getting a visa to India would be practically zero. So the government of India would not let you in to cover that story. And there are, instances like that in the Middle East, right? If you are Israeli, you might not be able to get a visa to be a reporter in an Arab country, and vice versa. So there are situations where governments will prevent you based on your identity, right, from being able to be present in that country. But I would think most news organizations would try very hard to not have that be any part of their consideration in assigning a story, other than finding the most capable journalists to do the job.
Yeah, and Lisa, we've talked about this a bit, that this wanting to, people care about the countries they care about because in part they have ties. You wouldn't want a young journalist to feel that they couldn't cover this attendee, couldn't cover their country, but they should understand the risks involved.
Yes, exactly. I think that it's transparency, right? And I think it is a news organization's obligation to educate journalists, whether they're young journalists or more experienced journalists, and support them through doing that security assessment, which absolutely should take into consideration their identity. I mean, the risks of a non-cis journalists reporting in Uganda are extremely high compared to a cisgendered reporter. That just has to be taken into consideration. I'm not suggesting in any way that a final decision be made on that identity issue, but journalists need to be aware of the dangers that they're encountering. I think a really serious situation is where family remains in that country. And that is often used against journalists who might come in and report and then leave, and then their families are targeted. And unfortunately, increasingly with some governments, we're seeing families targeted even outside of those countries. So these governments are really upping the ante in terms of trying to silence journalists, in particular, as we're noting here, journalists who have some sort of familial tie to those countries.
Gordon, have you seen that sort of harassment extending beyond the individual to others in the family, others in their circle that might have a chilling effect there?
Yeah, we have. And I think that's one of the more worrisome trends that we've seen. And that's one of those sort of things that was a taboo that is now being increasingly violated by governments. And, you see it not just with journalists, but with political dissidents and others. And I think that, you are probably you're more open to that kind of thing, and you're more likely to face hostility from a government if you really, if you understand that place, and if you speak the language, right? And those are, if you're a regime that does not want information about what they're doing out there, you don't want to. You want people who don't speak the language, who don't know anything about the place, to be reporting there, and not the others. We recently had, not just us, but a think tank in China put out a report about people of Chinese origin working for Western media. And the vituperation was aimed at women, and at men who were said to be gay. I don't know the orientation of any of those guys, but that was the way it was presented. And you end up in these layers of, they're traitors to their people, they're selling us out, they're using their knowledge of China to destroy China, working with China's enemies, that kind of thing, and photos of our reporters and their names and information are in that report. And obviously that kind of thing is extremely disturbing, but their people are being targeted because of their identity.
Yeah, I will mention, I'm familiar with a major news organization in the US that has a bureau in China, and the correspondent, who was a white American, reported something that was offensive, but they didn't go after the correspondent. They went after one of the young translators, and suddenly the next day her family didn't have a place to live anymore. So yes, there are other ways to harass news organizations by working around. Can you talk a little bit about this this idea that things have changed a little bit? I mean, I think in the past, even governments that eh, governments might like to present the notion that they are, oh yes, we want to give all organizations a chance to report freely in our country because they will see how wonderful our country is. Now there seems to be less of a, you know what, you don't really have the right to report whatever you want on our country. There seem to be at least lip service to free speech in the past, where I think that's less and less true. Do either
I,
of you see that?
so I don't want to interrupt you, Elisa. I think that is absolutely true, and I think that we've seen a kind of I don't know whether this is a cause or a symptom, but a creeping criminalization of journalism around the world as well, right? With the expansion of these kinds of fake news laws, whereby fake is defined as something the government doesn't like, expansion of espionage laws to the point where gathering almost any kind of information journalistically would be considered spying. So you end up with this kind of blanket laws that leave very little room for actual factual reporting, and at the same time, you're faced with sort of constant abuse uh, for producing fake news, right? And competing against government-funded propaganda. So it's not a not a pretty picture out there at the moment, I don't think.
Lisa, do you see
Yeah,
this?
I think it's obviously the shift towards authoritarianism, it feeds into this, but I think that what we see is these tactics just being copied around the world. What Bolsonaro does is then copied by somebody else. What Trump does is copied by another dictator, and the tactics are kind of textbook. And I also just want to disabuse the notion that a lot of people refer to, which is, oh, the internet, it's just a crazy mob. And it is a crazy mob, but it's a very orchestrated mob that is guided through the motions. And it's when organizations have researched these specific mob attacks against journalists, they find a very similar pattern over and over again. It starts at the top of the government mouthpiece targeting this person, and then it follows a very similar pattern. So these are tactical, the increase in SLAPP suits against journalists, and organizations and other governments are doing all they can to keep up with these tactics. And there's a lot of funding going towards trying to support journalists who are being targeted with lawsuits around the world, et cetera. But it's hard to keep up.
I want to talk, because so much of our audience is young journalists entering into their careers and thinking about this. Gordon, you referenced this with Evan. He has had quite a bit of experience. He is part of a major and important news organization recognized around the world. But I think also we are seeing more journalists going out into the world as freelancers, as independent reporters. And the dynamic for them to have the kind of, look, absolutely, it is important to highlight these stories of Austin and Evan, but there are also a lot of independent or people from very small organizations who do not have this kind of support, the kind of backing that you're able to give. How can freelance journalists, independent journalists, be protected when they go out into the world? To either of you, Lisa, maybe you should start there.
I'll say something very short on this and then let Elisa tell you, because, but I mean, we are incredibly fortunate and lucky at the Journal and at other large media organizations, the amount of resources that we do have and can spend on this. And even with that, and the amount of training and safety equipment and armored cars and body armor and everything else, it's very dangerous. And this is not meant to dissuade anyone who's a freelancer from going out and doing this reporting, but do avail yourself of the incredible services and resources at your disposal through groups like Elisa's, and she can tell you more about that.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, freelance journalists are left to rely on the nonprofit world, the nonprofit media development world that is supporting them and developing resources for them, making available some slots in hostile environments training. And so please do the research. There are resources out there that are at your disposal. And if you need more, then reach out. I think another great thing is networking. Really, this community is very supportive of each other. Women journalists support each other. When you get into a country, look up other freelance journalists. There are real communities out there. And I think that there are a lot of examples that we all have heard of, especially in conflict situations, of journalists working together, supporting each other. I know, for example, in Ukraine, when there were freelance journalists, they were joining forces with the journalists from major media organizations and sharing security and sharing advice. So I think that if you're on the ground in a dangerous place, rely on the journalists who are there, because I think that from what I have heard, there is a real generosity of spirit in these places and ability and willingness to extend those resources to others.
Yeah, and I also want
There
to,
absolutely is. So yes, look for the nearest journal reporter or other correspondent and stick together with the freelancers. There's strength in numbers.
yeah, I also want to highlight a documentary film called No Ordinary Life that a friend of mine produced. It's currently, I know, on Amazon Prime, I believe in other places as well, but it's about women videographers in conflict situations. I think, Lisa, you guys are probably familiar with it as well, but they're women photojournalists who have done this kind of work. And the reason I mention this is because I think so much is you don't know what you don't know, right? And if you have the opportunity to hear from other people, even in a film where they're, it's a unilateral thing, and you can learn about the experience that others have had, maybe it will inform you better as you, yes, No Ordinary Life film, thank you, in the webinar chat as well. But maybe it gives you an opportunity to consider some questions that you haven't considered, in addition to these kinds of seminars where you can actually sit down and think, okay, how would I handle a doxing situation, or what can I do with that?
And look to veteran journalists. I know from women journalists who are veteran journalists, have been covering wars for 40 years. There's a lot of ageism out there. And so they are having a hard time being hired and working as freelancers. But they are an incredible resource. I mean, if you're in a war zone next to Paula Bronstein, who has covered Afghanistan for 40 years, she's gonna have some tips for you. So I think it's really important to not only find the journalists who are working with major media organizations, but find those veteran journalists who have been around the block and who have very likely already been in these situations, possibly numerous times.
And these kinds of seminars, I think, are really important. The experience that all of us have had and have seen and have talked to people about will make you aware of things you hadn't even considered. Even this conversation, thinking about governmental intrusion and harassment of journalists in different parts of the world is possibly something you hadn't considered as you set out on your reporting careers. As we close up the hour, though, I want to take just a minute to think about this. And we have talked about some of the risks, and they are very serious risks, as we've seen in Evan and Austin's situation and so many others, risks, but also great rewards. And Gordon, can I begin with you on this? Like, you have lived it, you know that it can be bad, but tell me also, as a young journalist, it's going to be worth it.
Well, it's going to be worth it. I mean, it is a career like no other, and I think the world that we are living in, what we do is all the more important, right? The more we see politics shifting into post-fact environments, the more critical it is for us to be bringing people real stories about what's really happening in our own countries and around the world. And, you know, Evan was passionate about that and dedicated to that. I'm not sure I would be nearly as resilient as Evan is, but, you know, he's receiving hundreds of letters and he writes back hundreds of letters, and he is always encouraging us to keep up the work, to keep fighting, to keep reporting, to keep doing stories. And he's just looking forward to the day when he's going to be back out and reporting again. And we hope that will be very soon.
Do you think that he would return to Russia? Do you think? I mean, I see this often. Other correspondents who've had difficult experiences, whether it's imprisonment or injuries, they seem to want to go back. Do you think that he and others want that? And would you, as a news organization, support that?
I would support Evan in whatever he wants to do, because he's a brilliant journalist. I don't want to even speak or speculate for Evan on this, but you know, it's I think he spent a lot of years covering Russia. He's very dedicated and passionate about that story. I think he's probably passionate about a lot of stories, but you know, we've experienced this with a large number of our correspondents who were expelled from China. And you know, for a lot of these reporters, they had planned an entire career around reporting in China, and they now find themselves faced with a hostile state that's unwilling to let them do their jobs. And trying to cover China from outside China is a profoundly different experience than covering China from inside China, obviously. And, you know, for some people, that just does not work for them as journalists. And some people are, you know, so determined to stay on the China story that they find ways to keep reporting this from New York, from Singapore. You know, and others like Chao Deng is now reporting for us from Cairo and doing brilliant work in the Middle East. And you know, what she's really great at is being out there on the ground and reporting life as she sees it. And when she couldn't do that in China, she didn't want to keep covering China.
Lisa, do you see that passion for a story, that passion for a country, that passion for a culture and a people overriding, you know, any concerns about personal safety? And
yes, oh my goodness, I've met all of our Courage in Journalism Award winners for nearly 20 years that I've been doing this work, and this is not a cowboy attitude or adrenaline junkie attitude. I really want to dispel that stereotype of journalists who will return to the danger. This is an incredible commitment to justice and to revealing the truths of people who are often not told. So for me, it's just been an extreme honor to provide resources and support women journalists through most of my career, because I am in awe of their courage and willingness to put themselves at risk. That being said, being a journalist and even being a foreign correspondent does not mean that you have to put yourself at risk. I think we hear very often how important it is to cover your own community, to cover your local government entities. And the real fear is that with the loss of local journalism in the US and around the world, we are losing ground. And if you read the wonderful book written by Margaret Sullivan, Ghosting the News, you can see the incredible impact that journalism has in a community in terms of poverty levels, corruption levels. Where you lose journalism, all of these things go up. And so you don't have to put yourself in danger to really provide an incredible service to your community.
Just one thing that should go without saying, but maybe I should say it, especially for this audience, which is you're never going to be asked to put yourself in harm's way, right? Everyone who reports from Ukraine for us is a volunteer, and everybody's own comfort level with risk is taken into account. And so, some of the reporting we do in Ukraine is about the Ukrainian economy and things that are happening very far from the front lines. And for some people, that's a more acceptable level of risk than being closer to the combat kinds of situations. And so, the breadth of journalism is so extraordinary, and the risk continuum also so broad that there's a place for everyone, and all of that work is incredibly valuable.
And just one thought, because we didn't really get to it in this hour, but I do want to emphasize that there must be mental health support for those who have experienced whatever difficult or situation there is. That we really need to seek more support for that. That is what allows journalists to keep doing their work, right? To feel that they have that emotional and psychological support, particularly if they have been in a crisis situation. I know that is offered in big news organizations like yours, I'm sure, but also through such organizations as IWMF. And I think this is critical to keeping people on the path to doing great work that they do. Yes, mental health guide for journalists facing online violence, very important part of the work.
And for witnessing violence, I think we take it quite seriously, and you all should too, because you are going to see, hear, and be exposed to things in your careers that are deeply disturbing. And I've definitely, in my own case, benefited from talking to therapists, talking to counselors after these kinds of assignments. It's very helpful.
There's been a real culture shift around that, I'm happy to say, not just in the US, but around the world. The IWMF has an emergency fund. We have a regular emergency fund for journalists in crisis situations. And we also have a mental health support fund. And 80% of the requests for our regular emergency fund are for mental health services. So I think that there's a real recognition of the need for those. There was a really unfortunate attack in Ukraine recently. You may recall of the cafe that was bombed, and a Colombian journalist was killed. And just from that attack, the IWMF received numerous requests for mental health support.
It is important, and it does, as I say, it is critical for people to keep doing the great work and the important work that we do as journalists. Thank you, both of you, Gordon Fairclough and Lisa Munoz. The IWMF.org, International Women's Media Foundation. Please look at the resources they offer. Also understand that there are other organizations that do lend very important support to working journalists, particularly in the international and conflict environments. So please look for those if you are ever going to be in a situation like that. Even consider that they might be useful to you now in the earliest part of your careers. It doesn't mean that you have to be in a war zone to face conflict anymore. Indeed. Want to thank also the Dow Jones News Fund and the Freedom Forum, of course, for supporting and giving us the opportunity to have this conversation, which we think is critical to all of you, particularly at the early parts of your careers. Thank you to all of you who are participating and joining us today, putting in your questions. I know you have to go back to your internships and back to work for the day, so please do that. Don't want to get you in trouble with your bosses as well. We are going to be sending out some links both to this webinar and to the other resources that you've seen in the chat. So please keep a lookout for that and join us again. Thank you so much, all of you, for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.